Returning to one of the day's top stories, though, the government's push for the ability to veto collaborations between states and foreign governments. I'm joined live now by independent Senator Rex Patrick, whose position may prove key to whether legislation actually passes. Thanks for your time. This government push, it essentially says all these other organisations, unis, states, councils, shouldn't have a role in setting foreign policy. Do you agree with the push here?
Yes, I do agree with the push, and good morning, Tom. The Australian Constitution makes it very clear that external powers rest with the federal government, and the federal government are in the best position to assess what does and what doesn't fall within the national interest when we're talking about foreign affairs. So I am supportive of it. I will remind you, your viewers, that it's been almost 2 years since Victoria entered into a Belt and Road initiative with the Chinese government, and at that time I did call on a Senate inquiry which was opposed by both Labor and Liberal, and I think in hindsight that's regrettable. We could have been dealing with these things a lot earlier, but in principle I support the government's move.
Let's jump into that then. This is the deal most spoken about when people think of what might be vetoed. It's described, and we are a bit lacking on detail, as a partnership to get Chinese companies more involved in Victoria's infrastructure rollout. There might be some expertise, some good value projects and so on. And Australian companies would travel to China, perhaps being able to link up better with what's happening over in China as well. I mean, on the face of it, that's not necessarily a bad thing, is it? Where's the red line we're looking for?
No, I welcome investment from all countries into Australia, and indeed the opportunity for our companies to conduct business in other jurisdictions. But we always must apply the national interest test when we are engaging with foreign entities, particularly if there's a large purchase, for example, of an Australian entity here. We have to look at it from a national interest perspective, and it is the federal government that is best positioned to make sure that these things are in the national interest. So not discouraging
it's
any
going to
trade,
present some interesting
just
issues,
making sure.
And it could happen in South Australia. There could be some sort of deal done and the federal government overrules that without, you'd assume, because we're talking about national interest, much public knowing about that decision. Will you still be happy with that these experts and then the minister make the call, even if it's mostly behind closed doors?
I think we need to go back to the Victorian situation. You'll remember that this deal was pretty much signed in secret with the Victorian government. And I think what this proposed legislation will likely do is cause the states to engage with the federal government well before they ever sign anything, and hopefully get things to a sensible level. I will point out that I'm a very strong advocate with the FIRB of having decisions published. I think transparency is good. It's good for consistency. It's good so that everyone can understand reasons. So transparency around these things would also be good.
Well, transparency, we don't often argue against that. I wanted to ask you as well about the media, the look at media reform here on the side of exactly what happens to journalists, in particular around stopping raids on journalists. So on press freedom, the government's proposing that there will be an advocate to argue against warrants when they involve raids on journalists, so they would at least be able to argue the case. This would be an independent advocate, but not media companies actually able to represent themselves, and no carve-outs for journalists or media companies either. What do you make of this?
Oh, well, look, I think it's a step forward, but I remind you and your viewers that these are recommendations made by a government-controlled intelligence committee. So they'll always be reserved, and in some respects the recommendations don't go far enough. I have a bill before the Senate that basically places a constitutional protection for journalists, and in my view that's a much better arrangement, because then these sorts of issues don't become at the will of intelligence agencies or governments, but in fact determined by courts who can look at things independently.
So where does this go from here? Are you going to keep pushing the government to do more? Media companies, including, I should say, News Corp, owner of Sky News, are saying this isn't far enough?
Yeah, I agree it's not far enough. Of course, I'll have to wait and see what legislation comes out of the government as a result of the PJCIS's report. But I do have a bill that's on standby, and hopefully, if it's strong enough, that my bill won't be necessary, but I suspect I will then start to push for my bill to be considered by the Parliament.